They said Duke Ronan Blackthorne had buried 4 women in 10 years. They said his name alone could curdle milk, stop clocks, make horses refuse their stalls. They said the curse followed him like a second shadow, patient, inevitable, hungry. Every woman who entered Blackthorne Estate either fled screaming into the winter dark or was carried out feet first come spring. Lady Seraphina Valewood had heard every version of every story. She believed none of them. Not because she was brave, not because she was foolish, but because she had just spent 3 days in a rattling carriage watching her family's crest disappear into fog, and the only thought that kept returning, cold and precise as a blade laid flat against the throat, was this: the monster they sent her to was probably no worse than the ones who sent her. Stay close. What happens next will change everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and what it costs to survive. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Seraphina remembered that detail with strange clarity. The way the morning light fell through the breakfast room windows, thin and unconvincing. The way her Aunt Meredith set her teacup down with the particular care of someone who had already decided how a conversation would end before it began. The letter sat between them on the white tablecloth like something dead. "You understand what this means," Aunt Meredith said. It was not a question. Seraphina picked up the letter. Read it once. Set it down. "Banishment," she said. Relocation. Her aunt smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. "There is a significant difference. To the estate of Duke Ronan Blackthorne." Seraphina kept her voice level. She had learned that from her mother years ago. The Valewood women did not crack in front of witnesses. Cracking was something you did alone, in the dark, with the door bolted. "The man people call cursed. People say many things. They say women die around him." Meredith's eyes did not move from hers. "Women die everywhere, Seraphina. It is rather the nature of being a woman." That was the moment she understood. Not intellectually, the way you understand a theorem, but in the body, in the sternum, in the particular hollowness that opens up when you realize the people who were supposed to protect you have already calculated your worth and found the number small. The Valewood family needed her gone. Her refusal to marry Lord Cadric Ashburn, the arrangement that would have secured 3 votes in the High Council and a land corridor connecting 2 Valewood estates, had cost them something they valued more than her. Seraphina had not simply declined a marriage. She had interfered with a transaction. This was the invoice. She did not fight it. Fighting it would have required allies, and she had spent the past month watching every ally quietly step back, not from cowardice, but from self-preservation, which she understood and could not blame them for, even as she catalogued every face. She did not weep. She did not beg. She spent 2 days in her room going through what she owned, which turned out to be considerably less than she had assumed, since most of what she had lived with was Valewood property and therefore not hers to take, and she packed 1 trunk and 1 satchel, and on the morning of the 3rd day she walked out the front door of the estate where she had grown up and got into the carriage her family had arranged, which was slightly shabbier than the ones they kept for their own use. Small indignities. The Valewoods were thorough. The carriage ride north took 3 days and went from bad to worse in the way that journeys to uncertain places often do. The roads deteriorated as they climbed into hill country. The villages grew sparser. The sky dropped lower. By the 2nd night, the driver had stopped offering updates on their progress. By the 3rd morning, there was frost on the inside of the window glass, and Seraphina had stopped checking it. She thought about Cadric Ashburn during those 3 days. Not with longing. She had never felt longing for him, which was part of the problem, but with the clinical interest of someone trying to understand the mechanism of a trap. Cadric was not a bad man exactly. He was a soft man, which was different and in some ways worse. He wanted her inheritance more than he wanted her, which at least made him honest, but he wanted her to pretend otherwise, which made him exhausting. The arranged marriage would have given him her land holdings in the eastern counties and given her family their political alliance, and somewhere in the accounting Seraphina herself had simply not appeared as a variable worth calculating. She had said no on a Thursday morning in her Uncle Aldrich's study, clearly and without apology, and watched something shift behind Aldrich's eyes. Not anger, not yet, but the particular rearrangement of a man who has just realized an obstacle exists where he did not expect one. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. She thought about that trajectory now, watching the frost patterns on the glass. The accusation they had used was elegant in its vagueness: conduct unbecoming the Valewood name, a disgrace to family honor, behavior inconsistent with her station. No specifics were offered because specifics could be contested. Vague accusations were architectural. They shaped the space around a person without ever being testable. Who had she disgraced them in front of? When? How? The questions had no answers because the answers were not the point. The point was that she had said no to something her family wanted, and families like hers had been converting inconvenience into scandal for generations. Banishment to a cursed duke's estate was almost poetic. If she died there, it was the curse's fault. If she disappeared there, it was the isolation. If she was simply never heard from again, well, these things happened to women who had disgraced themselves. What could anyone do? Serafina pressed her fingertips to the cold glass and watched the fog thicken outside. What could anyone do, she thought. She was going to have to figure that out herself. Msad. Blackthorn Estate materialized out of the late afternoon fog the way some things did. Not gradually, with warning, but all at once, as if it had simply decided to exist in front of her. It was large. That was the first thing. Not large in the way the Valewood estate was large, the cultivated sprawl of old money maintaining its own mythology, but large in the way that land could be when nobody had bothered to make it decorative. The main house rose from the hillside like something that had grown there rather than been built, dark stone against darker sky. The kind of structure that did not ask whether it was beautiful, because that had never been the point. The iron gates at the entrance stood open. She noted that. Either they were expecting her, or they never closed the gates, and she could not decide which possibility was stranger. The carriage passed through and stopped in the front courtyard. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the front door opened and a woman came down the steps. Mid-50s, dark dress, gray hair pulled back with the severity of someone who had decided, at some point, that aesthetic comfort was a luxury she did not require. She moved with the precise economy of a person who had run a large household for a long time and no longer needed to think about most of it. Lady Valewood. Not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement of a fact. Yes. Serafina stepped down from the carriage without assistance. I take it you were informed of my arrival. We were informed. The woman's expression suggested she had opinions about that. I am Mrs. Harwick, housekeeper. The Duke has asked me to show you to your rooms. The Duke is occupied. Something moved behind Mrs. Harwick's eyes, briefly, not hostility, Serafina thought, but assessment. He will join you for dinner if his schedule permits. If his schedule permits. In her family's house, that phrase would have been an insult wrapped in protocol. She filed it and followed Mrs. Harwick up the stone steps and into the house. The interior was not what she expected. The rumors had suggested, variously, Gothic decay, deliberate menace, the accumulated atmosphere of a man who wanted to frighten people. What she found instead was a house that had been lived in seriously. The entrance hall was not decorated for effect. No dramatic portraits, no theatrical weapons display, nothing calculated to impress or unsettle. There were books stacked on a side table, their spines cracked from actual use. There was a coat hung carelessly on the newel post. There was, improbably, a dog sleeping on the floor near the staircase, large, elderly, unconcerned with her arrival. Hound, Mrs. Harwick said, by way of neither explanation nor apology. The dog opened one eye, closed it again. They went up the stairs and down a corridor that smelled of wood smoke and cold air. The room she was shown was at the eastern end of the house, well-proportioned, adequately furnished, a window that looked out over the hillside and beyond it the dark suggestions of forest. A fire had been laid. Someone had thought to put a small lamp on the writing desk. Dinner is at 7, Mrs. Harwick said. Should you need anything before then, you may pull the bell. She paused at the door. The grounds are navigable. You are not a prisoner here. Serafina looked at her. That is an interesting thing to specify. Mrs. Harwick's expression did not change. It tends to be relevant with the guests we receive. Then she left. Serafina stood in the middle of the room and let the silence of the house settle around her. It was not the silence of emptiness. She could hear, distantly, sounds of the household operating, something in the kitchens, footsteps somewhere below, the wind working at a shutter somewhere down the corridor. But none of it was performed. The house made noise the way any working household made noise, not as atmosphere but as function. She crossed to the window and looked out. The fog had thinned slightly. She could see the shape of the grounds now, formal gardens that had been kept but not manicured, the kind of upkeep that spoke of respect for the land rather than pride in its appearance. Beyond them, a tree line, and beyond that, nothing visible. Just the blurring of the world into gray. She had been sent here to disappear, she was fairly certain. The only question was whether she would cooperate. No. Dinner came and the Duke did not. A maid, young, quiet, who gave her name as Petra, brought a tray to her room with a short note from Mrs. Harwick. The Duke's schedule had not permitted. No apology, no elaboration. Serafina ate alone at the writing desk, watching the fire, and tried to take inventory of what she actually knew versus what she had been told. The list of things she had been told was long. The list of things she actually knew was much shorter, and the gap between them was where she had learned, over the past several years, that most of the real information lived. She knew she was in a remote estate, effectively exiled, with no immediate allies and no clear timeline. She knew her family had moved quickly and cleanly, which meant this had been planned for some time before they executed it. She knew the Duke had not greeted her, which could mean hostility, indifference, or simply a man who did not feel obligated to perform hospitality on a stranger's schedule. She did not know whether she was actually in danger. That last one was the relevant question, and she was honest enough with herself to admit she did not have enough information yet to answer it. She went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept badly, which surprised her less than the fact that she slept at all. The next morning, she decided to learn the house. This was not strategy, exactly, or not only strategy. She had always understood buildings as texts, the way they were organized, telling you something about the mind that had organized them. Her father had taught her that years before his death, walking her through the Valewood estate and pointing out how every architectural choice concealed a choice about who was supposed to feel comfortable where and who was supposed to feel watched. She went methodically, ground floor first, then the outbuildings, keeping to spaces that were clearly intended to be accessible. The kitchen staff noticed her and did not comment. The housekeeper passed her in the east corridor and acknowledged her with a nod. Nobody stopped her, nobody followed her. The instruction that she was not a prisoner here appeared to be operationally accurate, at least for now. It was in the library that she found the first indication that Ronan Blackthorne was not what the stories said. The library occupied the entire south wing of the ground floor, 2 rooms, floor to ceiling, with a connecting archway. She had expected the performative library of a powerful noble house. Impressive volumes nobody read, collected for weight and appearance. What she found was a working collection, extensively used, organized according to a system she could not immediately decode, but which was clearly a system. Margins were annotated. Books were flagged with strips of paper. Texts on law were interleaved with texts on agriculture, which were adjacent to texts on medicine, which were next to structural engineering. She was standing with a volume on water rights law open in her hands, annotated in a compressed, deliberate script she did not recognize, when she heard the door. She turned. He was taller than she had expected, not performing his height, simply occupying it, the way some people occupied space, with a completeness that wasn't aggression but wasn't quite neutral either. Dark coat, no ornamentation. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a few years either side of it, with the kind of face that would be called cold by people who did not understand the difference between cold and controlled. Dark eyes that moved to the book in her hands and then to her face with the same level of attention, neither alarmed nor particularly welcoming. A scar ran from his left jaw down to his throat, old and well-healed, the kind that came from something deliberate. "You found the library," he said. His voice was low and even, accented with the particular flatness of the northern provinces. "I did." She did not put the book down or apologize for handling it. "It's a considerable collection. I find books more straightforward than most alternatives." He walked to the desk at the far end of the room without self-consciousness, as if the library were his natural environment and her presence in it was an unexpected but not intolerable weather event. "Water rights law," he said without looking up. "Yes." "Are you interested in water rights law, Lady Valewood?" "I'm interested in what people choose to annotate," she said. "It tells you more about their priorities than they'd probably like." He looked up then. The assessment in it was brief and precise. "Does it? You've marked every exception clause, every loophole, every instance where the law as written conflicts with the law as enforced." She closed the book carefully and returned it to its place. "That's not a legal scholar's approach. That's an advocate's approach. Someone looking for leverage points." A silence opened. "Most guests," Ronan Blackthorne said, "decline to analyze my reading habits on the second morning. Most guests probably didn't notice your reading habits." "No." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not quite, but the shadow of something that had once known what warmth was and had not entirely forgotten it. "They did not." He pulled a folder from the desk drawer and opened it without further commentary, which was, she understood, both a dismissal and a test. She left the library. Standing in the corridor outside, she let herself process what had just happened, pressing her palm flat against the stone wall because the cold of it was useful. He was not what she expected. That was the first honest assessment she had been able to make since arriving. The stories, the curse, the menace, the series of dead women who were supposed to haunt this place, had prepared her for something theatrical, for someone who wore his darkness as costume. Instead, she had found a man in a library, annotating law books before breakfast. She did not know what to do with that yet. 2 weeks passed. She fell into the rhythm of the estate the way you fell into cold water. The initial shock replaced gradually by a functional kind of adaptation. She learned the staff, Mrs. Harwick, whose severity covered a pragmatic loyalty so deep it had become structural. Petra, the young maid, who was frightened of almost everything but not of Seraphina, which suggested either intelligence or a hierarchy of fears. Old Thomas, who managed the stables and had opinions about horses that were extensive and mostly correct. A groundskeeper named Breck, who said almost nothing and worked with a focused solitude she recognized and respected. She learned the house, and then the grounds, and then, slowly, the edges of the village that sat 2 miles down the hill. The village was where the first crack appeared in the narrative she had been given. She had expected, based on everything she'd heard, a community in the grip of fear, the classic arrangement of a cursed lord and his terrorized tenants. What she found was something more complicated. The villagers were cautious about discussing the Duke, yes, but the caution was not fear. It was closer to the caution she'd observed in people protecting something valuable. An elderly woman named Sila, who ran the village's only dry goods shop, referenced the Duke with a particular compression around her eyes, the look of someone who had made a decision, long ago, about what they would and would not say to strangers. "He keeps to himself," Sila said when Seraphina asked cautiously how the village found the Duke as a landlord. "That's what I hear." "What you hear?" Sila weighed flour with careful attention. "You hear a lot of things, I imagine, from far away." "The curse," Seraphina said. "The women. I heard quite a bit about that." Sila's hands paused on the scale for just a moment. "Did you?" "Stories seem to travel faster than fact usually does." The old woman looked at her then. Really looked, the way people looked when they were deciding whether you were worth the risk of honesty. Whatever she found in Seraphina's face, she seemed to make a decision. "Things happen," Sila said finally, returning to the flour. "Things happen to people who go where they aren't wanted. That's not a curse. That's just how things work." She would not say more. Seraphina walked back up the hill, turning that sentence over. Things happen to people who go where they aren't wanted. It could mean a dozen things. The problem was that 2 of those dozen things were interesting. She found the records 3 weeks into her stay. She had not been looking for them specifically, or rather, she had been looking for something without knowing its shape, in the way you sometimes knew an anomaly existed before you could name it. The pattern she had noticed, references in the few letters she had intercepted through the normal household channels, invoices, correspondence with suppliers, occasional notes from distant tenants, to people who were not part of the visible household. Names that appeared once and not again. Deliveries of quantities slightly too large for the staff she had counted. The records were in the estate office, in a cabinet that was locked but not hidden, which was either carelessness or a statement. She found them when Mrs. Harwick, in a moment that might have been deliberate and might have been coincidence, left the office key on the kitchen table and walked out of the room without comment. Serafina stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the key. Then she picked it up. The cabinet held 3 years of estate accounts, bound and dated, and she went through them methodically, cross-referencing figures, tracking discrepancies. What she found took her an hour to fully understand. There were expenditures that did not correspond to any identifiable estate function: food, medicine, clothing, in quantities and categories that suggested dependents the records did not name. There were transfers of funds to locations across 3 different counties, formatted as estate business, but pointed, when she traced them carefully, toward addresses that were not businesses at all. There was a notation system she did not recognize, in the same compressed handwriting she had seen in the law books. She sat in the estate office for a long time after she realized what she was looking at. Not records of corruption, not records of cruelty, records of concealment, but the kind of concealment that cost money rather than making it, that moved resources outward rather than inward, that maintained, somewhere in its logic, a consistent destination. She was still sitting there when she heard the footstep in the doorway. She did not reach to hide the records. She did not move at all. Some instinct she had learned from years of navigating the Valewood house told her that flinching was more damaging than stillness. Ronan Blackthorne stood in the doorway of his own estate office, looking at her sitting at his desk with his accounts spread across the surface, and his expression was not what she anticipated. She had anticipated anger. She had anticipated the kind of cold, controlled fury that a man with his reputation would presumably deploy against a woman who had broken into his records. He looked, instead, like someone who had just had a calculation confirmed. "You are faster than I expected," he said. She set down the ledger in her hands. "You left the key out." "I did." That was either very trusting or a test. "It was information," he said. He walked into the room, not toward her but to the window, where he stood with his back half turned, looking out at the grounds. "I needed to know how you think." "Why?" The silence that followed had texture to it, not the silence of someone choosing words, but the silence of someone weighing a decision that had already been made and was simply being executed. "Because your family sent you here for reasons they did not share with me," he said. "And I have found, in my experience, that when a family sends away one of their own using manufactured disgrace as pretext, they are usually disposing of something they find inconvenient." He turned from the window. "Not someone, something. Inconvenience is always specific." The precision of it hit her somewhere she had been keeping locked. "My inheritance," she said. "The Eastern County holdings. My father left them to me directly, which created a complication when Cadric Ashburn needed them as part of an arranged marriage." Ashburn. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. The slight shift of a man cataloging new information that confirms an existing map. "How much of it?" "All of it. Under the original bequest, I control the title outright until marriage, at which point they would transfer to my husband. If I died unmarried, they would revert to the family estate." She kept her voice flat. She had become good at flat. "If I refuse the marriage and remain unmarried long enough, I come of age under the full inheritance clause and become uncontestable." "When?" 18 months from now." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And they sent you here 4 months after you refused the marriage?" "Yes." Something moved behind his eyes. Not sympathy exactly. Something older than sympathy and more useful. "They were not hoping you would simply disappear into the countryside," he said. "They were hoping the story would do the work for them." She met his eyes. "The curse." "Yes." She pressed her hands flat on the desk surface. Not a gesture of anything, just grounding herself in the physical reality of wood grain and cold air and the weight of what was being said plainly between them for the first time since she had arrived. "And if I die here," she said, "it confirms the legend. Nothing suspicious, Just another woman undone by the cursed Duke. He did not deny it. I don't intend to let that happen, he said. His voice had not changed, neither had his face. But the sentence carried something underneath it that she recognized. Not a promise exactly, but an intention so settled it had passed through the stage of being a promise and into simply being a fact. But I need you to understand that this house is not what it appears from outside. What you found in those records is a fraction of it. She looked down at the ledgers, back up at him. Tell me the rest, she said. He studied her for a long moment. The scar along his jaw caught the afternoon light, old silver against old skin. Not yet, he said. She felt the frustration of it, clean and immediate, the way frustration was when you had just gotten to the edge of something true. Why? Because there are people here, he said, who are trusting me with their safety, and I have known you for 3 weeks. He walked to the desk, picked up the ledger she had set down, and closed it with a care that was almost gentle. When I am certain of you, I will tell you everything. And what does certain look like? He set the ledger down. Come to dinner tonight, he said. I'll eat with you. It was not an answer, or it was an answer to a different question. She was not sure as she gathered herself and left the office whether that made it better or worse. She came to dinner. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the window in the dining room with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking, looking out at the grounds in the last of the daylight. He did not perform noticing her arrival. He simply turned when she sat down and came to the table, and for a moment they were just two people sitting across from each other in a room that smelled of cold stone and wood smoke. Dinner arrived. They ate. The silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. You said the records were a fraction, she said, when the first course had been cleared. I did. Are the people in those records in danger? Less than they were. He set down his fork. More than I would like. From the nobles who orchestrated the original attacks. The word attacks landed between them, and neither of them flinched from it. You found more than I expected, he said. I found the pattern. She had. The accounts had told her enough. Payments that aligned with specific dates, specific incidents that had been publicly attributed to the curse. A fire, a carriage accident, a woman who had come to the estate and died of an illness that moved faster than illness usually did. Each one traceable, in the paperwork, to an expenditure that didn't match. Resources spent responding to something rather than causing it. The curse is cover, she said, but not for you. No, for something else. He looked at her across the table, and she had the distinct sensation that she was being given a decision. Not consciously, not as a dramatic gesture, but in the real way that decisions happen between people. Not a moment, but an accumulation pressing toward a threshold. The accidents, he said carefully. The women who suffered. What did you conclude? That they were attacked, she said. Not by you, and that you spent money you could not publicly explain managing the aftermath, protecting the people involved, because explaining how you knew would have exposed something you are not in a position to expose yet. A beat. Yes, he said. And the curse reputation. Keeps people cautious, he said. A feared man is left alone. A feared man can do things that an ordinary man would be investigated for. She absorbed this. The wine in her glass caught the candlelight. I was not sent here to live, she said. No. His voice did not change. You were sent here to disappear. If the curse took you, there would be no investigation. If you simply never returned to society, grief, isolation, the tragedy of a disgraced woman, there would be nothing to question. He paused. I intercepted the letter your family sent to my household. They had instructions for the staff. She went very still. What instructions? He looked at her with the specific steadiness of someone delivering information that is important and painful and cannot be softened without losing the truth of it. To ensure you did not correspond with anyone outside the estate, he said, to monitor your health, to report to them monthly. He picked up his wine, finally. The framing was concern for a troubled young woman. The function was a cage. The silence that followed was the loudest she had experienced in some time. And the staff, she said carefully. Follow my instructions, he said. not your family's. She sat with this for a long moment. Outside the window, the dark had fully arrived. The grounds invisible now. The estate an island of candlelight in a countryside that went on without witness in every direction. The thing she felt was not gratitude. It was too complicated for gratitude, too mixed with the slow-burning understanding of exactly how methodically her family had moved. What she felt was something closer to clarity, the particular cold clarity of a situation understood on its actual terms rather than as you wished it were. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Why are you protecting me? You don't know me. I was sent here as someone else's problem. There's no benefit to you in keeping me safe and significant risk in having me here at all." She held his gaze. "So why?" He set down his wine. "Because I know your family," he said. The sentence was simple and carried a weight under it that she could not yet fully see. "I know what they are involved in, and I know that what they did to you is what they do to people who become inconvenient, and I have been collecting evidence for 3 years, and I need—" He stopped. The stop was not dramatic. It was the stop of a man who had almost said something he had decided not to say yet. "You need something," she said. "I need more time," he said finally, "and I need not to be fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously." It was an honest answer, more honest, she thought, than she had received from almost anyone in the past year. She nodded slowly. "Then we understand each other." "We understand the beginning of each other," he said. Not correction exactly. Precision. She could work with precision. She found the first of the bodies 3 weeks later. Not a body. She understood that quickly, correcting the word in her mind as she processed what she was seeing. A room. In the east wing, behind a door she had not tried because it was marked as storage, and she had believed that. A room that had been made habitable. A pallet, blankets, a water basin, the remains of a meal not more than a day old. Someone had been here. Someone had left in a hurry. The thing that stopped her, that made her press her hand to her mouth and stand very still in the middle of the small, cold room, was what she found on the floor beside the pallet. A child's drawing, done in charcoal, on the edge of what appeared to be packing paper. A house, simple and immediate, the way children drew houses. And beside it, 2 figures, sized to suggest an adult and a child. And beneath both figures, in a child's unsteady printing, a single word: safe. She was still standing there holding the drawing when she heard the commotion from the floor below. Boots on stone moving fast, voices she did not recognize, and then Ronan's voice, sharp in a way she had not heard before, cutting through the others. And then a sound that turned her blood to ice. A gunshot. Not close, somewhere on the grounds, in the dark, in the direction of the forest. But not far enough. Never far enough. She folded the drawing carefully and put it in her pocket and ran. She ran without thinking about running, which was how you ran when the sound behind the thinking hadn't caught up yet. Down the east wing corridor, one hand trailing the stone wall for orientation in the dark, the child's drawing folded in her pocket, pressing against her hip with each stride. The gunshot had come from the direction of the forest edge. She had placed it in the half-second before her body started moving, the way sound could be located before the mind finished processing it. The main staircase. The entrance hall. She hit the front door and pushed through it into cold air that hit her face like a hand. The courtyard was lit by 2 torches and contained 3 people she had not seen before. A man she didn't recognize holding a horse by its bridle, Mrs. Harwick standing very still near the steps, and Ronan. He was not looking at the forest. He was looking at her. "Go back inside," he said. "What happened?" Serafina. The use of her name, first name, no title, the first time, landed somewhere between them with a weight she didn't have space to examine. "Go inside." "There was a shot." "I am aware of that." He turned back to the man with the horse, and she caught the tail end of something passing between them. Not words, just a look, the compressed communication of people who had done this before. The man nodded once and led the horse around the side of the house at a pace that was not panicked, but was not casual either. Mrs. Harwick appeared at Serafina's elbow. "My lady," soft, firm, the kind of voice that had managed crises before and knew that volume did not help them. There was someone in the East Wing, Serafina said, not to Mrs. Harwick, to Ronan's back because he had already turned away. A room behind the storage door. Someone had been living there. A child. He went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a man recalculating something that had just become more complicated. He turned back to her. In the torchlight, his face was a study in controlled damage, the jaw tight, the scar catching the orange light, the eyes doing something she could not name but recognized as the look of a person absorbing a cost they had already budgeted for, but hoped not to pay this soon. "How long ago did you find it?" he said. 20 minutes, maybe less. He looked at Mrs. Harwick. Something passed between them too quickly for her to read. "Get her inside," he said. "Lock the east wing, and send Breck to the south tree line." He walked into the dark without another word. She let Mrs. Harwick take her arm. She went back inside because the alternatives were either following him into the dark unarmed, which was idiotic, or standing in the courtyard achieving nothing, which was worse. She sat in the kitchen while Mrs. Harwick put a kettle on the fire with the focused movements of a woman who knew that occupation was its own kind of steadiness. And she took the child's drawing out of her pocket and laid it flat on the kitchen table and looked at it. Safe. She pressed her fingertip to the word and felt the charcoal smear slightly under her touch, and thought about what it meant to draw that word in a room you were hiding in. Not wish to be safe, not trying to be, just the word as a statement, as a fact being willed into existence by someone who needed it to be true. "The child," she said. Mrs. Harwick poured water, did not turn. "Mrs. Harwick, I heard you. Then answer me." The housekeeper set the kettle down on the trivet and turned, and her expression was the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was making a decision right now, in this kitchen, about whether to put it down. "The Duke will speak with you," she said, "when he returns. And if he doesn't return, he always returns." It was said with a flatness that was not performance. "That is the one thing I can tell you with certainty. He always returns." Serafina looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the drawing. She turned it over in her hands and noticed, for the first time, what was on the back of the packing paper. Not a drawing. Numbers. A column of figures, small and careful, in handwriting too adult to be the child's. Amounts. Dates. And beside each date, an initial. 3 letters, C, M, and V. She looked at the V for a long time. V for Valewood. Ronan came back 2 hours later. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on stone. The particular cadence of a man moving fast but not running, someone who had moved through the dark often enough to have made peace with it. He came into the kitchen, still in his coat, bringing cold air and the smell of pine with him, and he stopped when he saw her at the table with the drawing in front of her. He looked at the drawing, then at her face. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her steadily. "This is my kitchen. I know whose kitchen it is. Sit down." Something moved through his expression, not amusement, but the ghost of something in the vicinity of it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "The child is safe," he said, before she could ask. "They were moved 2 days ago. What you found was where they had been." "Moved where?" "Somewhere I'm not going to tell you yet." The yet landed. She let it. "The figures on the back of this paper," she said. She turned it over and pushed it across the table toward him. "Those are Valewood transactions." He looked at the paper. His face did not change in any way that was visible, but she had been watching his face for 5 weeks now, and she caught the subtle arrest of it, the fraction of a second where the processing was not yet complete. "Where did you find this?" he said. "With the drawing, in the East Wing room." She waited. "Ronan." He looked up at the use of his name. She had not used it before. The air in the kitchen shifted slightly, the way air shifted when something had been established that had not existed before. "Your family," he said, "is not simply trying to dispose of you. They're part of something larger, a consortium of noble families who have been systematically removing obstacles to a set of land and title acquisitions across 6 counties. He laid the paper flat. "The people in those hidden rooms, the people I have been moving, sheltering, getting out of sight, are witnesses. Or heirs? Or both? She heard what he was saying, felt it settle through her like cold water finding its level. And the initial V, she said, your Uncle Aldrich is involved. Has been for at least 4 years. He looked at her with the specific attention of a man watching for the exact thing that would tell him whether someone could hold what they were being given. Your banishment served 2 purposes. It removed you from your inheritance timeline, and it was meant to put you somewhere you could be made to disappear without investigation. She put both hands flat on the table. What she felt was not shock. That was the thing. She had expected shock, had braced for it, and found instead something she didn't have a clean word for. Something that sat in the chest with the weight of a thing that has been suspected and is now confirmed. It was almost a relief, which was its own kind of terrible. 4 years, she said. At least. My father died 4 years ago. The silence between that sentence and his response was 3 seconds at most. It felt longer. Yes, he said. He did. She looked at him across the table. Say what you mean, she said. I don't have proof yet. His voice had not changed. That steadiness, she had come to understand it as not coldness but discipline, the practiced steadiness of someone who had learned that emotion was information and not performance, and that deploying it poorly cost more than containing it. I will not tell you what I suspect about your father's death until I can put evidence beside it. But you suspect. I suspect a great many things. He looked at her. I need you to trust that when I'm certain, I will not hide it from you. She breathed out slowly. The witnesses you're sheltering, she said, are they in danger because of the consortium or specifically because of my family? Both. The families overlap. Aldrich operates through intermediaries, which is why it has taken so long to map. But the attack tonight... He stopped. What attack? The shot was a warning. Whoever fired it was not on the estate grounds. They were at the forest edge. He picked up the paper with the figures and folded it carefully. Someone knows we have guests, not who they are, but that we have them. A spy in the household. Or surveillance from outside. His jaw was tight. I don't know which yet. That is the problem. She looked at him, at the line of his shoulders, the scar, the compressed control of a man managing too many variables simultaneously and doing it without anyone to share the weight with. How long have you been doing this alone? She said. He did not answer immediately. It was a different kind of pause from the others, not strategic, but something that had to be navigated. 3 years, he said. Since the first attack on a witness, I was trying to get to safety. Since I understood that reporting what I had found through official channels would simply alert the people I was reporting to. Because they are the official channels. Many of them, yes. She absorbed this. You built the legend deliberately, she said. The curse was already attached to my name. There had been stories for years, old Blackthorn family mythology, that I had done nothing to encourage but also nothing to dispel. After the first 2 women who came here were attacked, not by me, not on the estate, but the timing was used, I understood what the stories could do. He looked at the table, not her. A man with a dangerous reputation is left alone. Visitors are discouraged. The remoteness becomes an asset. People can disappear into this estate without it being suspicious, because everyone already assumes this is a place where people disappear. The curse is infrastructure, she said. He looked up. That ghost of something moved through his expression again. Yes, he said. That is the accurate description. She did not sleep well, which had stopped surprising her. She lay in the room at the eastern end of the house and turned what she knew in the direction of what she suspected and tried to find the shape of it. The thing that kept returning was not the revelation about her uncle, not even the implication about her father. What kept returning was simpler and sharper. That her family had spent 4 years building something, and that somewhere in the architecture of that thing she had been a variable, an asset while she was compliant, a liability the moment she wasn't. She had gone her entire life believing that the Valewood name meant something to the Valewoods themselves, that whatever their political maneuvering, whatever their cold ambitions, there was somewhere beneath it a bedrock of blood loyalty, a floor you did not fall through, She had been wrong. There was no floor. There was just the fall, and how long it took to understand you were in it. She thought about what Ronan had said. Things happen to people who go where they aren't wanted. Sila's words in the village, but she understood now what they contained. Not just observation, knowledge, the kind you acquired by watching happen to people around you. The child's drawing was on the nightstand. She looked at it in the dark. You made the things that were true, she thought, until they were true enough to hold weight. In the morning, she went to find him before breakfast. He was in the library again. She had come to understand that this was his default position when he was working through something, the library as cognitive space as much as physical one. He was at the desk with a map spread across it, marking something with a pencil, and he did not look up when she came in. I want to help, she said. He continued marking the map. I know. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you. He looked up then. The financial records, she said. I understand them. I grew up in a family that ran their corruption through financial instruments. Land transfers, title adjustments, investment structures that looked legitimate until you knew what to look for. I can read what you have. She came to the desk. You've been doing this alone for 3 years because you needed someone who understood the financial architecture. I understand the financial architecture. He looked at her for a long moment. If you help me, he said, you become a target. I'm already a target. She held his gaze. The only difference is that right now I'm a target who knows nothing useful. If I help you, at least my being a target costs them something. He studied her face with that assessment that was becoming familiar, the precise, unrushed reading of a person rather than a situation. She let him do it. She had nothing to hide that was worth hiding. Your family's financial records, he said finally. How much access did you have? Enough. My father kept me informed, more than they realized after he died. I know the structure of the Eastern holdings, the investment channels, the name of the solicitor they use for unofficial transfers. She paused. And I know which ledger they keep the real numbers in because my father told me where it was. I have not yet told you this because I was not sure of you. He was quiet for a moment. And now? She thought about a man who had intercepted a letter that contained instructions for her slow disappearance and had instead spent 5 weeks protecting her without telling her she needed protecting, because telling her would have required trusting her with information she might not have been ready for, and he had waited until she found it herself. Now I'm sure enough, she said. He looked at the map, back at her. Sit down, he said. I'll get the other ledgers. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. He spread what he had across the desk, and she went through it with the specific attention she had learned to apply to financial documents, not reading them the way an auditor read them, looking for formal error, but reading them the way you read a letter from someone who was lying, looking for the place where the story broke its own internal logic. She found the first break within an hour. This transfer, she said, in the 3rd year of records, the amount matches a sale of timber rights in the Eastern Valewood holdings. But the timing is wrong. The timber sale closed in the spring, and this transfer is dated winter of the same year, before the sale. She looked up. Whoever structured this reversed the timeline. They transferred funds to the recipient before the legal transaction that supposedly generated them. Ronan leaned over the desk beside her. His shoulder was close to hers. She was aware of it and set the awareness aside. Which means, he said, which means the timber sale was a fabricated rationale after the fact. The funds came from somewhere else. And if we find where they actually came from, we find the source of the consortium's operating capital. He straightened. I had identified that transfer as anomalous, but could not locate the inversion. I was looking at it as a destination problem. It's a source problem, she said. You were looking at where the money went. You have to look at where it came from before the transaction existed. He looked at her with something that was not surprise, but was perhaps its version in a man who did not express surprise often. Yes, he said. They kept working. The afternoon light moved across the library floor, slow and particular, and she tracked it without meaning to. The way time moved differently when you were doing something that mattered. She had not felt that in a long time. The sensation of engagement with something real, something with actual stakes, something where being sharp mattered more than being polite. The loneliness of the past year had not been about isolation. She understood that now, sitting at a desk with a man who spoke to her like someone worth speaking to. The loneliness had been the loneliness of being surrounded by people who needed her to be a certain size to be manageable, and the slow suffocation of spending years making yourself small enough to fit. She was done with that. 3 days later, Breck knocked on the library door. He came in without waiting for an answer, which she had come to understand was not disrespect, but the household signal that something required immediate attention. He was still in his outdoor coat, mud on his boots. He looked at Ronan. "Rider from the North Road," he said. "Valewood Crest." Seraphina's hand stopped on the ledger she was holding. Ronan straightened slowly. "How many?" One. Young, not a guard." She put the ledger down. "A messenger." Breck nodded, looked at her with the careful look of someone deciding how much to say in front of a variable whose value they were still calculating. She had seen it from others in the household. It was fading slightly over the past weeks, but it was not gone. "Shall I?" Breck began. "I'll receive the message," Seraphina said. Both men looked at her. "It came from my family," she said. "I will receive it." She looked at Ronan, not asking permission, indicating an intention. He looked at her for a moment, then, "Breck, show the messenger to the front hall, then step out." Breck left. Ronan looked at her. "Whatever they've written, I know how to read what they write," she said. "I've been doing it my whole life." She stood, setting the ledger aside with a steadiness she had to construct but which held. "You can observe if you want, but I'm not going to need protecting from a letter." He said nothing, but he followed her to the door and stood in the corridor outside the front hall while she went in. The messenger was young, 17 perhaps, with the look of a household runner rather than a formal courier. He handed her a sealed letter without meeting her eyes, the way people handed things to those they'd been told not to think too much about. She broke the seal. The letter was from Aldrich. It was 8 lines long. It expressed, in the particular compressed language her uncle used when he was applying pressure while maintaining the appearance of concern, that the family was troubled by her continued silence, that they hoped she was finding the arrangement at Blackthorn Estate satisfactory, that they hoped she was giving serious consideration to the practical matter they had discussed before her departure. The practical matter: Kedrick Ashburn, the marriage, the land. At the bottom, in Aldrich's hand, a single additional sentence that had not been run through the language of diplomatic concern. "We trust the Duke is keeping you properly contained." She read it twice, folded it, dismissed the messenger with a word. She stood in the empty front hall for a moment with the letter in her hand and let herself feel the full, cold weight of it. The casual ownership in those words, the assumption so complete it had not even been disguised. Properly contained. Not kept safe, not kept well, contained. She had been, in her family's accounting, a problem to be managed. For her entire life, in various formulations, she had been exactly that. And she had spent years trying to be small enough and agreeable enough to avoid the particular cost of being a problem, and none of it had worked. And here she was in a stranger's house holding a letter that used the word contained. She turned and walked out of the hall to where Ronan waited in the corridor. She held out the letter. He read it once. His expression did not change, but his hand tightened once on the paper, brief, controlled, the only visible sign of something running underneath the surface. "They know you're here," he said. "They want to confirm the plan is on track." "Yes." "And they assume I'm cooperating with them." "They assume everyone cooperates with them," she said. "That's always been their fundamental error." He looked at her. The corridor was dim, the afternoon light falling sideways through a window at the far end, and in that light his face was all planes and shadows and the old silver of the scar, and she had the sudden understanding that she was looking at someone who had been alone in this for a long time and had built that aloneness into the architecture of everything he did, the way you built load-bearing walls. "We write back," she said. "I write back. Something that confirms the appearance of containment while we finish mapping the financial chain." She held his gaze. "How much time do you need?" 3 weeks? Maybe 4. Then I buy us 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. Serafina. Her name again, the same way. Not formal, not performed. Just her name, used carefully. If they suspect, they won't. She took the letter back from him. I know exactly how to speak to them. I've been speaking to them my whole life. She looked at him. Trust works in both directions. You told me that. Implicitly, but you told me. He looked at her for a long moment. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. She was already walking back toward the library when she heard him, quietly, behind her. The solicitor, he said. The one who handles the unofficial transfers. You said you knew his name. She stopped, turned. Hargrove, she said. Edmund Hargrove. He keeps an office in the capital, but operates out of a secondary location in the North Quarter. She paused. And he was at my father's deathbed. My uncle said he was there to manage the estate paperwork. Ronan's face did not move. Hargrove, he said carefully, is the man whose name appears in the records I cannot trace past a certain point, the one I have been trying to locate for 8 months. The hallway between them was very quiet. He's alive? She said. As of 6 weeks ago? Yes. She breathed in. Then we have him, she said. Ronan shook his head slowly. We have his name in connection to transactions. That is not the same as having him. He looked at her. But it is the closest anyone has gotten. She looked at him across the corridor, the distance between them reduced to something that had ceased being purely physical some time ago without either of them naming it. Then we are closer than you have ever been, she said. He said nothing, but he did not look away. What? She found the letter that night. Not the one she'd received. She had already written her careful, calibrated response to Aldrich, every word selected to suggest compliant unhappiness without tipping into either rebellion or false contentment, the specific register she had learned in childhood for surviving conversations she could not win. That letter was sealed and ready. This letter was different. She found it in the East Wing, in the room she had been drawn back to without fully knowing why. The empty room with the pallet, the room that still smelled faintly of habitation. She had come back because the drawing stayed with her, the word safe written by a child's hand, and she had stood there looking at the bare pallet until she noticed what she had not noticed before. A loose stone in the wall behind the pallet, low to the floor. She pulled it out. Behind it was a folded piece of paper, older than the drawing, the fold lines worn soft with handling. She opened it. It was a list of names. 12 names, written in 2 different hands, with dates beside each one. Some names she did not recognize. Some she recognized from the ledgers she had been working through. And 2, at the top, circled in what appeared to be a different ink, added later, 2 names she knew personally. Aldrich Valewood. And beneath it, in the second hand, in ink that was newer, Edwina Valewood, her mother's name. Her mother, who had died 8 years ago. Her mother, whose death had been recorded as a fever of the lungs, quick and merciful, they had said. Gone in a week. The room tilted slightly. She put her hand on the wall. Below both names, in a third hand she did not recognize, small and urgent, pressed hard into the paper, 3 words. They are coming. She stood in the hidden room for a long time with the paper in her hands, not reading it again. She had read it twice, and the words had arranged themselves into a shape she could not unsee, the way certain things could not be unseen once they had passed through the eyes and settled into the body as fact. Her mother's name. Circled. Listed alongside Aldrich's with the specificity of a document that was not accusing. It was recording. Recording what had already been decided or what had already been done. They are coming. The ink on those 3 words was different. Newer. Someone had found this paper after it had been hidden and had added that warning in a hand she did not recognize, pressed hard enough into the paper that she could feel the indentations on the back with her fingertips. She folded the paper and put it inside her dress, against her skin, where it would stay until she decided what it meant. Then she went to find Ronan. Banished. He was not in the library, not in the dining room. She found him in the stables, which should have surprised her, and did not. She had learned in the past weeks that when he was working through something, he moved, physically, the way some people paced and others went still. He was brushing down the gray horse in the end stall with the focused mechanical attention of a man using his hands to keep the rest of himself from moving too fast. She came in without announcing herself and stood at the stall door and held out the paper. He read it. She watched his face while he read it. The compressed stillness, the jaw, the point where his eyes reached the circled names and stopped moving for just a moment before continuing. When he finished, he held the paper without lowering it, looking at something past it. "Where?" he said. "The east wing room, behind a loose stone in the wall." "The third hand," he said, the warning at the bottom. "That is not one of my people." No. She had already determined that. The writing was nothing like Mrs. Harwick's practical script or Breck's near illegible shorthand. Someone else found that paper and added to it. Someone who knew where it was hidden. He lowered the paper. "My mother," she said. Her voice was level. She had made it level the way you made a surface level, by deliberate pressure applied until the wobble stopped. "The name beside my uncle's, Edwina Vale Wood. I see it. She died 8 years ago. They said fever." "I know." The two words hit differently than they should have. She looked at him. "You know," she said. He looked at her with the steadiness that she had come to understand was not coldness, but the discipline of a man who had learned to hold difficult things still rather than put them down too fast. "I suspected. I have not been able to confirm it. The records I have suggest that the consortium's escalation in that region corresponded with the timing of her death, but correlation is not—" "Don't." The word came out flat and harder than she intended. She took a breath. "Don't give me the evidentiary standard right now. I'll want that later. Right now, just tell me what you think happened." He was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted in the stall. Outside, wind moved through the stable yard. "I think your mother discovered something," he said. "I think she found evidence of what Aldrich was involved in, and I think she became a problem that needed to be managed." He looked at her. "I think the fever may have been assisted." The silence that followed was the kind that had physical weight. She had known. She understood that now, had known in the place below knowing, in the place where the body kept its own records separate from what the mind was willing to process. She had known since she read the letter in the hidden room and felt something rearrange itself in her chest, not breaking but restructuring, the way a building shifted when a load-bearing element was removed. She pressed her hand flat against the stall door and felt the wood grain and the cold iron of the latch and grounded herself in the physical fact of being in a body, in a stable, in a house in the hills, alive. 3 weeks, she said. "What?" "You said you needed 3 weeks to finish mapping the financial chain." She looked at him. "That was 3 days ago. What's changed since the writer came?" He studied her. Then, "One of my informants in the capital sent word this morning. The consortium is moving faster than anticipated. There is a royal gathering scheduled in 14 days, a formal hearing on land title disputes in the eastern counties. The Valewoods will be there. Ashburn will be there." He paused. "And the evidence my informant believes they plan to present will effectively formalize the seizure of your inheritance while you are here, too far away and too recently disgraced to contest it." 14 days. She had thought they had weeks. She had been writing calibrated letters and reading ledgers and building something careful, and the ground had been moving under it without her knowing the speed. "Then we go to the gathering," she said. "That is precisely what they would want." His voice was controlled, but she heard something underneath it. Not fear, but the particular pressure of someone managing a situation that had just exceeded the parameters they had built for it. "If you appear at a royal gathering without preparation, without allies, without the evidence assembled and in the right hands, they will simply move against you there, publicly, with the full weight of the consortium behind it. And if we don't appear?" He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. If they didn't appear, the hearing proceeded without them. The evidence was accepted without contest. The inheritance was formalized as lost. "Then we prepare in 14 days what we planned for 3 weeks, she said. "Serafina, don't." Again, flatter. "Don't tell me it isn't enough time. I know it isn't enough time. Tell me what we have and what we're missing, and we'll figure out the gap." He looked at her for a long moment. The horse behind him exhaled, slow and loud in the quiet stable. "We have the financial chain mapped to 70%, he said. "We are missing the connection between Hargrove and the consortium's primary account. We have witness testimony from 3 people I have sheltered here. We are missing independent corroboration from someone within the consortium itself." He paused. "And we are missing anything that puts Aldrich at the center rather than the periphery. Right now he could claim the financial transactions were made on his behalf without his knowledge." "He can't claim that," she said. "Not if I testify to the conversation I had with him 3 weeks before my banishment. He told me explicitly that the Eastern holdings would revert to the family estate if I refused the marriage and remained unmarried. He knew the inheritance clause. He calculated the timeline. That is not periphery." Ronan looked at her. "You would testify against your own family." "They are not my family." The sentence came out clean and without heat, which was more final than anger would have been. "They have not been my family for some time. I was just the last one to update the accounting." He held her gaze. Then he handed the paper back to her. "Keep that," he said. The third hand at the bottom, the warning. "I want to know who wrote it before we go anywhere." "How?" "Because," he said, "someone knew that paper was there. Someone found it and added to it and chose to warn rather than to remove it. That person is either an ally I don't know about or a trap I haven't identified yet." She looked at the paper in her hands. "And if it's a trap?" "Then we've already been compromised," he said. "And the question is how badly." The answer to that question came 24 hours later, and it came from a direction neither of them had been watching. Mrs. Harwick knocked on the library door at precisely 7 in the morning. Serafina noted the time because she had been awake since 5, working through the last section of the financial record she had not yet fully mapped, and she had been listening to the house in the particular way she had developed over weeks, tracking its rhythm so that any deviation registered. Mrs. Harwick's knock was 2 beats too fast. She was in before Ronan answered. "There's someone at the east gate," she said. "They've been there since before dawn." She looked at Ronan. Her face was its usual severity, but beneath it something was moving that Serafina had not seen there before. Something tight and forced down. "It's your brother." The room went very still. Serafina looked at Ronan. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. Not frozen exactly, but locked, the way a mechanism locked when too much opposing pressure was applied simultaneously. He did not speak for a moment. "Marcus," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "He is alone?" "2 riders with him. Stayed back on the road." Mrs. Harwick's hands were clasped in front of her. "He asked to speak with you. He said he had information about the gathering." Serafina watched Ronan's face during this exchange and filed every microsecond of it. The locked quality, the specific way he said his brother's name, the half-second before he responded to the word alone. "Show him to the front room," Ronan said. "Don't leave him unsupervised." Mrs. Harwick left. Serafina looked at him. "You have a brother?" "Yes." "Who you have not mentioned?" "No. And he's here, having apparently known to find you at this estate, with information about a gathering that only a very small number of people knew you had reason to care about." Ronan looked at her with the locked expression still in place, and she saw him processing. Not the situation, she realized. He had already processed the situation. He was processing what to do about the fact that she had just laid it out correctly and was looking at him expecting an answer. "Marcus has been in the capital for 2 years, he said. "I have not been in contact with him. When I began this work, I ended contact with everyone who could be used as a pressure point." He paused. "The fact that he is here means one of 2 things." "He found you on his own," she said. "Or someone told him where you were." "Yes." "And if someone told him, then the question is who and what they told him to do when he got here." He moved to the door. "Stay in the library. Don't come in unless I ask you to." She looked at him. "Or," she said, "I come with you. And if your brother is what you're afraid he might be, having a witness is an asset rather than a liability." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. She went first. Aton. Marcus Blackthorne was younger than his brother by perhaps 5 years, and the family resemblance was strong enough to be disorienting. Same height, same dark coloring, a face that occupied similar architectural territory but was arranged with less discipline. Where Ronan's features had been carved by whatever the past 3 years had made of him, Marcus looked like the version of the same material that had not been subjected to the same pressures. He stood in the front room with his coat still on, hat in his hand, and when Ronan walked in, he looked at him with an expression Serafina catalogued in the first second. Relief, guilt, and underneath both of them, something else, something that was trying to stay buried. Ronan! He crossed the room in 3 strides. Ronan did not move toward him. Marcus stopped at the invisible edge of that stillness. I know what you're thinking. Do you? I know how this looks. His eyes went to Serafina, brief, assessing, then back to his brother. I need you to listen to me before you decide what it is. Tell me how you found this estate, Ronan said. His voice was the flat, controlled voice she had heard him use when he was managing something that required absolute precision. Not cold, colder than cold. Marcus's jaw tightened. I've known where you were for a year. I chose not to come until now. Why now? Because 3 days ago a man named Hargrove came to see me. The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Serafina did not move. He told me he had information about what you were doing. He offered me... Marcus stopped, looked at his hands. He offered money and a land title in the south that our family lost 20 years ago. The room was very quiet. And you took it, Ronan said. I didn't take anything. I listened. Marcus looked up. His eyes had something raw in them that Serafina recognized. The look of a man who had made a calculation he understood was wrong while he was making it and made it anyway, and was now standing in the specific aftermath of that. I let him believe I was considering it. I came here instead. To warn me. Yes. Or to confirm my location and report back. Marcus flinched. It was small and controlled, but it was there. I came here to warn you, he said, quietly. You can believe that or not, but Hargrove knows about the witnesses. He knows about the financial records. He knows you've been working with someone inside a Valewood-adjacent network. His eyes moved to Serafina for a moment. I think he knows who she is. Serafina spoke for the first time since entering the room. What did Hargrove look like? Marcus turned to her. Whatever he had expected her to say, it wasn't that. Older man, 60, maybe. Gray, thin. He had a signet ring on his right hand. Unusual setting. The stone sat high. She knew the ring. She had seen it at her father's bedside. She had been 12 years old and her mother had been alive, and Edmund Hargrove had been introduced to her as a family friend, and she had thought nothing of it because she had been 12 and her father was dying and there had been too much else to hold. He's been in contact with my uncle for at least a decade, she said. She kept her voice even. Possibly longer. She looked at Ronan. If he offered Marcus the family land, he had Aldrich's authorization to do it. That is consortium currency, not personal. Ronan had not taken his eyes off his brother. The witnesses, he said. What exactly did Hargrove say he knew? He said there were people on this estate who were going to testify at the gathering. He said it needed to be managed before they got to the capital. Marcus held his brother's gaze. He used that word. Managed. And what does managing look like in his framing? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He didn't specify, he said. He didn't have to. The weight of that settled over the room. Serafina looked at Ronan and saw something happening behind his eyes that she had not seen before. Not the controlled processing of new information, but the particular pain of an equation that had just resolved in the worst of its possible directions. His brother. Someone who had been told where he was for a year and had not come until now, and had come now only after sitting across from a man who had offered him something he wanted and had chosen, in the end, to be here instead. The choice was real. She could see that. But the fact that there had been a choice to make, that there had been a moment of sitting across from Hargrove and listening and calculating, that was also real, and it was sitting in the room with all of them. How much did you tell him? Ronan said. Before you decided to come here. The silence was 4 seconds. I confirmed that you were at this estate, Marcus said. He already knew. I did not tell him anything about the records or the witnesses. But you confirmed the estate. Yes. Ronan turned away from his brother. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and Serafina watched the line of his shoulders and understood that she was watching a man absorb the specific pain of a betrayal that was partial, qualified, the worst kind, not complete enough to be simple, not small enough to be dismissed. The warning was real. The love that had motivated it was probably real, and the moment of calculation that had preceded it was also real. All three things were true simultaneously, and there was no version of this in which only one of them counted. "Ronan," Marcus said. "I need you to stay in this house," Ronan said without turning. "You will not send any communication outside. You will not have contact with anyone who has been in contact with Hargrove. And you will tell me everything you know about what Hargrove believes we have and what he plans to do about it before the gathering." Marcus exhaled. Something in his posture shifted. Not relief, but the particular release of a man who had been waiting for judgment and received instead a conditional reprieve. "Everything," he said. "I'll tell you everything. You'll start now." They were 3 hours into it when Breck came to the door. He didn't knock this time either. He came in at a speed that was new, and his face was the face of a man who had been moving fast through cold air and had not stopped to arrange his expression. He looked at Ronan. "The safe house in the northern quarter," he said. "Petra sent word. Someone broke in 2 hours ago. The family we moved last week." He stopped. His jaw worked. "They're gone." Serafina felt the bottom of something drop away. Not the witnesses from the estate. The family from the northern safe house. People Ronan had moved after the shot in the forest. People who had been sheltered somewhere she had not known about. Another layer of the operation she had not yet seen. Ronan stood up. "Anyone hurt?" he said. "Petra doesn't know. She found the house empty and signs of a forced entry. Recent. She got out and sent the message." Ronan looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him with the expression of a man watching the consequence of his choices take physical form in a room he was standing in. "The northern quarter house," Ronan said very quietly. "That location was not in any record I have shown you. It was not in any information I had reason to believe Hargrove possessed." He held his brother's gaze. "Who else did you speak to before you came here?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Serafina had ever heard. "Marcus." Her own voice, unexpectedly, not soft. "Who else?" Marcus closed his eyes. He was quiet for a moment that felt geological, the kind of moment where the surface of a thing held and then did not. "Hargrove's associate came to see me before Hargrove did," he said, 2 days before. I did not tell him anything specific. He asked about Ronan in general terms, and I said I hadn't been in contact, which was true, but he showed me a document. He opened his eyes. A document with the Northern Quarter address. He asked me if I recognized it. I said, no. "But your face said yes," Ronan said. Marcus did not answer. Ronan turned away from his brother for the second time in an hour, and this time when he turned away, it was final in a way the first time had not been. He looked at Serafina. She looked back at him. In his face, she saw what it looked like when the structure a man had built over 3 years. The careful architecture of protection and concealment and controlled exposure. Cracked not at the foundation, but at the point he had considered safest. Not the enemy. Not the unknown. The person whose existence he had factored out of the equation because factoring them in would have been unbearable. She understood this with a clarity that had nothing borrowed in it. She had factored her family out of the worst possibilities for the same reason. She had wanted a floor, and there had not been one. A family in the Northern Quarter was gone. 14 days until the gathering. And Hargrove now knew enough to move against not just the witnesses, but the infrastructure that had hidden them. "We can't wait," she said. "No," he said. "The 14 days? We don't have them anymore." "No." He looked at her. The locked quality was gone from his face. What had replaced it was something stripped down and real, the face of a man who had run out of the option of managing his situation from a distance and knew it. "We have to go to the capital now, with what we have." 70% of the financial chain and 3 witnesses. Yes. Against the full consortium, at a hearing they convened in front of officials they have spent years cultivating. Yes. She held his gaze. Then we need one more thing, she said. One person inside the consortium who will break. Someone who was there and has enough left to lose that staying silent costs more than speaking. She looked at him. Hargrove. Ronan's expression shifted. Hargrove works for them. Hargrove is 70 years old and has spent 40 years managing transactions for people who would erase him the moment he became inconvenient. He offered your brother a land title. She looked at him steadily. He offered something valuable. That means he has access to valuable things. And a man with access who is also expendable is a man calculating how long he has left. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. You want to approach Hargrove. I want to approach the man who stood at my father's bedside, she said, who has known my family for decades, who came to your brother with an offer instead of simply eliminating the problem, which tells me he is hedging. She held his gaze. He is looking for a way out. I can give him one. If you're wrong, you walk into the center of their network. If I'm wrong, we lose, she said. If we do nothing, we also lose. The difference is what we're willing to risk to change the outcome. The room was very quiet. Marcus sat against the wall with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the floor, present and not present. The way people sat in rooms where they understood they had forfeited the right to shape what happened next. Ronan looked at Serafina. She had changed since the East Wing room, since the paper with her mother's name. Not broken. The opposite. Something had been removed that had been adding weight, some final hope that this was less serious than it was, that somewhere a floor existed, and without that hope she was lighter. She was standing in a room where the man she had come to trust had just been partially betrayed by the person he had trusted most, and she was looking at him without flinching, and what she felt was not fear but the cold, clean urgency of a situation that had arrived at its real shape. She was done being managed. She was done being a problem to be solved by other people's hands. Tell me how to find Hargrove, she said, and then get the witnesses ready to move. Ronan looked at her for a long moment more, then, his secondary office, north quarter of the capital, above a cartographer's shop on the Merchant's Row. He paused. He goes there Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today is Tuesday, she said. Yes, he said. It is. They rode out within the hour. No ceremony to it. Ronan gave orders in the compressed shorthand of a man who had rehearsed contingencies for long enough that the contingencies had become the plan, and the household moved around those orders with the precision of people who had been waiting on some level for this moment to arrive. Mrs. Harwick packed the ledgers into a leather satchel that had been prepared. Serafina noted this. The prepared satchel, the evidence that Ronan had always known this day would come and had built toward it quietly, the way you built toward something you hoped not to need. Breck saddled 4 horses. The 3 witnesses were brought from wherever they had been kept and loaded into a covered cart with Petra driving and a man Serafina had not seen before riding beside her, armed. Marcus was left at the estate with 2 of Breck's people and instructions that were delivered in a tone that made argument structurally impossible. He did not argue. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and watched his brother move through the room and said nothing, and the nothing had a texture to it. Not sullenness, but the particular silence of a man carrying something he understood he had earned. Serafina mounted without assistance and did not look back at the house as they rode through the gates. The capital was 6 hours by road. They had until morning. They rode hard the first 2 hours and let the horses breathe the third, and during that 3rd hour the road flattened into farmland and the sky went from black to the particular blue-gray that preceded dawn, without yet being it. And Ronan pulled his horse alongside hers, and they rode in silence for a while. Hargrove will not be easy to turn, he said finally. I know. He has been operating in this system for 40 years. He understands what happens to people who break ranks. He also understands what happens to people who outlive their usefulness, she said. He's seen it happen. He's probably arranged it. She kept her eyes on the road. That's what I'm going to give him, the mirror. Let him see himself in it. Ronan was quiet for a moment. And if he calls for help the moment you walk in, then we're finished regardless. We have 70% of the chain and 3 witnesses and no independent corroboration. If we go to the hearing without Hargrove and without the missing 30%, Aldrich's lawyers dismantle us in the first hour." She looked at him. "Hargrove is not a gamble. Hargrove is the only move." He held her gaze in the gray pre-dawn light. The scar along his jaw was very clear in that light, old and permanent, the mark of a world that had already tried to remove him once. "When we get to the city," he said, "I want you to go to Hargrove's office from the south approach. I will take the witnesses to the advocate I have been building this case for. She knows the structure of the hearing. She can file for emergency presentation of evidence before the session opens." He paused. "If Hargrove turns you, send the signal. One of my people will be watching the cartographer's shop." "What signal?" "Open the window above the shop door." She nodded. "And if he doesn't turn," he said, "then I'll have what we need and we meet at the advocate's office before the hearing convenes." She looked at him. "What time does it open?" 9 o'clock. She looked at the sky, estimated. "Then we have time," she said. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the corridor after she had said, "They are not my family." The look of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already fully calculated. "You are not frightened," he said. It was not an accusation. It was closer to observation. "I am," she said. "I'm just past the part where it helps to show it." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that," he said. Then nothing more, because some things didn't need the sentence finished. She understood. "You reached an age where the dead gave you their best lines and you carried them forward because they couldn't. They rode." The capital arrived the way capitals did. Gradually and then all at once. The road widening, the farms giving way to inns and then to houses, and then to the compressed density of a city that had been growing for 200 years without ever deciding on a plan. By the time they entered the North Gate, the sun was fully up and the streets were in motion, the particular organized chaos of a market day overlapping with the beginning of a formal session at the courts. Ronan pulled her aside at a crossing 2 streets from the Merchants' Row. Serafina. Her name, the same way. Careful. Real. She looked at him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, small, dense with writing, sealed with a plain wax stamp. "If Hargrove asks what you are offering him in exchange for testimony, give him this. It is a letter from my advocate guaranteeing witnessed immunity for financial crimes committed prior to the current year, contingent on full testimony." He paused. "Do not offer it until he has said something that commits him. If you offer it too early, he will know you need him more than he needs you." She took the document, felt the weight of it. "And if he has already committed to the consortium's version, then the immunity is worthless, and we are out of options." He held her gaze. "But you will know before you offer it. You will see it in his face." She looked at him for a moment. There were things that could have been said and were not said, and she was aware of this in the way you were aware of a room's dimensions without measuring them. They were standing in a city street with 6 hours until a hearing that would determine everything, and the space between what they had become to each other and what there had been time to say about it was a specific kind of distance that she understood and did not try to close. "Go," she said. "Get the witnesses to your advocate." He held her gaze 1 beat longer. Then he turned his horse and moved. She turned hers toward the Merchants' Row. The cartographer's shop was exactly what Ronan had described. A narrow building on a street of narrow buildings, its window displaying elaborate maps of coastlines and mountain ranges, the kind of shop that was both entirely real and an excellent location for an operation that needed respectable cover. The sign above the door said, "Merchants' Row Cartographic Society," in letters that had been painted recently enough to still be legible. The door above, accessed by a side stair, was plain wood, no sign. She tied her horse at the post on the street and went up the side stair without stopping to think about it, because stopping to think about it would have introduced the fear past the point where it was still useful, and she needed to be thinking about Hargrove's face and not her own heartbeat. She knocked. A pause. Longer than social convention required. The door opened. Edmund Hargrove was exactly as Marcus had described him. 60-something, gray, thin in the way of men who had always been thin rather than men who had become it. The signet ring was on his right hand, the stone high set, catching the morning light. His eyes moved to her face and registered her with the rapid precision of a man who cataloged people professionally, and she watched the calculation happen in real time. Who she was, what her presence meant, what the variables were. He did not speak. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I think you know who I am." "Lady Valewood." His voice was dry and careful, the voice of a man who had spent decades saying exactly as much as was necessary and no more. "You are not where you are supposed to be." "No," she said. "May I come in?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. The office was small and meticulously organized. The organization of a man who understood that disorder was evidence. Files ranked by date, correspondence sorted, nothing left out that did not need to be. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over the street below. She noted the window, kept that in her peripheral awareness. He did not offer her a seat. She sat anyway. He remained standing, which was fine. Standing men wanted to keep options open. Standing meant he had not yet decided this was over. "You were at my father's bedside," she said. 11 years ago. I was 12. I remember the ring." "I had business with your father's estate," he said. "That was my function." "Your function," she said. "Yes." "Let's talk about your function." She looked at him steadily. "You have been structuring financial transactions for the Valewood Consortium for at least a decade. You have facilitated the transfer of land titles, the movement of funds through entities designed to obscure their origin, and the management of witnesses who became inconvenient. I have the financial records. Not all of them, yet, but enough to establish the pattern, and enough to put your name at the center of it." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had heard accusations before and knew that accusations required proof to become problems. "You have records," he said. "I have 3 years of ledgers, annotated and cross-referenced, with your signature on 11 transactions and your notarial seal on 4 more." She kept her voice even. "I also have witness testimony from 3 people you helped disappear who are currently in the care of an advocate preparing to file for emergency presentation at this morning's hearing." Something moved in his face. Small, controlled, but there. "You are making a significant claim," he said. "I am making an accurate claim," she said. "And I think you know I am, because you went to Marcus Blackthorne 2 days ago, which means you already knew the Duke had been building this case and you were trying to manage the situation before it arrived at exactly this point." She held his gaze. "You are a careful man. You have survived 40 years in this system by being careful, so let me ask you something careful." He waited. "How long do you think Aldrich Valewood will keep you alive after this hearing?" she said. "Win or lose? Win. You are a liability who knows too much. Lose, you are the person who failed to contain it. Either way." She let that sit for a moment. "You know what happened to my mother? I believe you were there for that too, in your function as facilitator. And I believe you have been living with the knowledge of that for 8 years, which is a long time to carry something you can't put down." His jaw was very tight. "You don't know what you're saying," he said. "I know exactly what I'm saying." She did not raise her voice. Raising it would have been wrong. This required the opposite of volume. "I'm saying that you are a man who has outlived his usefulness in the consortium's accounting and has not yet realized it, or has realized it and is looking for an exit that doesn't exist." She reached into her coat and held the document, just held it, not offering it yet. "I can give you an exit." He looked at the document in her hand. "Whatever that is," he said, "it is not worth the risk." "No," she agreed. "But the alternative is worth calculating clearly." She set the document on the desk between them. "My advocate is filing for emergency presentation in 4 hours. What I have is enough to open the investigation. Once the investigation opens, every transaction you have ever managed becomes evidence. Every name you have ever worked for becomes a person with a reason to ensure you cannot testify." She held his gaze. "You have 1 window. It is this morning, in this room, before that filing is complete." He looked at the document. He looked at her face. She watched him, not the visible surface of him, but the thing underneath it, the thing that was doing the real calculation. She had read her family's financial instruments for long enough to know that beneath every structure of apparent solidity was a load-bearing assumption, and when that assumption shifted, the entire structure's weight redistributed instantaneously. The load-bearing assumption of a man like Hargrove was that loyalty to the consortium was the only safe position. She was not arguing with that assumption. She was demonstrating that it was false. He reached out and picked up the document. Read it. Set it down. The immunity covers financial facilitation, he said, prior to the current year. Yes. It does not cover... He stopped. It does not cover everything, she said. But it covers enough to keep you out of a prison cell, which is where you will be regardless if you do nothing, because the moment we file, your name appears in the record, and Aldrich's people will move to cut you loose before you can move at all. She held his gaze. You have survived this long because you were careful. Be careful now. The silence stretched. Outside on the street below, the city moved. Cartwheels on stone. Someone calling to someone else 3 buildings down. The ordinary noise of a morning that did not know what was happening in the room above it. Hargrove picked up the document again. There are records, he said slowly, that are not in any estate ledger. Private accounts, maintained separately, that establish the full chain of the consortium's financial structure over 15 years. He looked at her. Including the source of the funds used for the management of inconvenient situations. She held herself very still. Where? In a lockbox at the Merchants' Bank on the King's Road. In my name. He set the document down again. If I give you the key and the documentation to access it, if I testify to what those records contain, the immunity holds. The immunity holds, she said. You have my word, and you have that document. Your word, he said, with the faint dryness of a man who had spent 40 years in a world where words were instruments. And the Duke of Blackthorn's advocate's seal, she said, which is more durable than either of us. He looked at her for a long moment. He opened the desk drawer. He produced a small brass key and a folded letter of authorization, and she had to control the impulse to reach for them too fast, because reaching too fast would have confirmed something she didn't want confirmed, that she had needed this more than she had shown. She took both items with the steady hands of a woman who had known this was coming, and she put them inside her coat, and she stood. The advocate's office, she said, is on Court Street, number 14. You should be there before 9. He said nothing. She turned for the door. Lady Valewood. She stopped. Your father, Hargrove said, behind her. His voice had changed. The dry precision of it had shifted to something that was not remorse but was its geographical neighbor. He was a better man than the family he came from. I want you to know that I don't, she said. Not cruelly, just finally. There is nothing you can say about my father that I want to hear from you. Come to the advocate's office before 9. That's all that matters now. She went down the stairs and into the street, and her legs were steady, and her hands were steady, and it was only when she reached her horse and pressed her face briefly against the animal's neck into the warm smell of horse and leather that she allowed the shaking, just for a moment, just the 3 seconds it took to move through her and out. Then she mounted and rode. The advocate's office on Court Street was already in motion when she arrived. She heard Ronan's voice before she saw him, not raised, but with a velocity to it she had not heard before, the voice of a man driving a process forward through sheer applied will. She came through the door and the room was full. Ronan, 3 witnesses seated along one wall with the particular exhausted stillness of people who had been moving through fear for too long, and a woman at the central desk who could only be the advocate, 45, sharp-eyed, with the organized intensity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this delivery. Ronan looked up when she came in. She held up the key. Something happened in his face. She could not have named it precisely. It was not relief, not quite, because relief implied the possibility of the opposite had been genuinely entertained, and she thought that for Ronan the opposite had been genuinely entertained for a long time, and the emotion was more complicated than relief, something that was relief with depth behind it. Hargrove, she said. Yes. He will be here before 9. He has a lockbox at the Merchants' Bank with 15 years of records. She crossed the room and laid the key and the authorization on the advocate's desk. Full financial chain, source accounts, and he will testify to what they contain. The advocate picked up the key, looked at Ronan. File the emergency presentation, he said. She turned to the desk and began writing. Serafina turned to the witnesses along the wall. 2 women and 1 man, ages she could not pin precisely, all carrying the particular compaction of people who had been small for a long time to stay safe. She looked at each of them in turn. They looked back at her with the eyes of people who were still calculating whether this was real. "It's almost done," she said. Not loud, not performative, just true, spoken to people who needed to hear something true. A few more hours. One of the women nodded, very small. Ronan appeared at her shoulder. "The hearing convenes in 3 hours," he said quietly. "We present to the panel before the consortium's session opens. If the advocate can get the emergency filing accepted, the evidence goes into the formal record before Aldrich's case is heard. And if the panel denies the emergency filing, then we argue it as a procedural challenge during the session itself, publicly." His voice was level, but she heard the thing under it, the understanding that public argument was messier, less controlled, more easily disrupted by people with allies in the room. "It's a worse position, but not unwinnable." "No," he said, "not unwinnable." She looked at the advocate writing, at the witnesses along the wall, at the key on the desk. "Then we go to the hearing," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. In 3 years of operating alone, building this case by increments, sheltering people whose names he had never spoken publicly, moving through a kingdom that thought him cursed and left him alone for that reason. In all of that, he had been waiting for a moment that was now 2 hours away. She could see it in him, the compressed weight of years pressing toward this specific point, the way water pressed at a dam, not with noise, but with the constant, unbearable application of its entire mass. She had arrived at his estate 7 weeks ago expecting a monster. She had found instead a man who had converted his own legend into a shelter and lived in its shadow for 3 years without breaking. She thought, this is what it looks like to decide what you're going to be and then be it at full cost. She thought, I understand that now in a way I did not understand it before. She looked at him and did not say any of this. We should go over the presentation order, she said instead. He held her gaze for just 1 moment more. Then he turned to the desk. But they arrived at the Hall of Civic Hearing with 40 minutes to spare. The building was large and old, the kind of stone that held cold regardless of the season. Its corridors already populated with the anticipatory movement of a formal session, lawyers, clerks, functionaries, and at the far end of the main corridor, visible from the entrance, the doors to the main hearing chamber standing open. And standing at those doors with 2 men beside him and the particular stillness of someone who had been waiting was Aldrich Valewood. He looked at Serafina the way he had looked at her in his study the morning she had refused Cadric Ashburn. The specific look of a man confronting a miscalculation, not with alarm but with the rapid, cold reassessment of someone determining how to reclassify the variable. His eyes moved to Ronan, then back to her. Serafina, he said. The name deployed as a tool, warm with the warmth of a performance. What an unexpected and concerning surprise. We had no knowledge you had left Blackthorn Estate. We have been quite worried. I'm certain you have, she said. His eyes went to the satchel in Ronan's hand, then to the advocate walking beside them. The reassessment in his face moved faster. Whatever you believe you are doing, Aldrich said, and the warmth dropped out of his voice the way a mask dropped, clean and complete. You do not understand the forces you are involving yourself with. I understand them precisely, she said. That is the problem for you. One of the men beside Aldrich, she did not know him, but his stance was wrong for a lawyer, wrong for a clerk, moved his coat slightly, and beneath it she saw the edge of a weapon. Ronan saw it too. You are in a public building, he said, his voice low and utterly flat, speaking to Aldrich rather than to the man beside him, during a formal civic session, surrounded by officers of the court and members of the public. Whatever you are considering, calculate the cost before you move. Aldrich's jaw was tight. He was calculating. She could see it. The variable that had been contained was not contained. The evidence he did not know existed was in a satchel 12 feet from him. The solicitor who was supposed to be an asset had not appeared this morning, which meant something had gone wrong, and he did not yet know what. A man did the most dangerous things, she had learned, in the moment when his calculation failed and he had not yet identified the new one. "Uncle," she said. He looked at her. "Step aside," she said. His eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she had not expected and probably should have. Not rage, not fear. Something colder and more personal. The look of someone who had made a decision about her value years ago and was watching that decision fail in real time, and hated her for it not because she was his enemy, but because she had been supposed to be manageable. She had been the floor he thought could not give way. He stepped aside. She walked through the doors of the hearing chamber. Ronan walked beside her. The chamber was larger than she had imagined. High ceilings, stone walls hung with the formal insignia of the court, benches filling with witnesses and interested parties, and at the front, elevated on a raised platform, 5 members of the royal hearing panel taking their places with the deliberate ceremony of people who understood that ceremony was itself a form of power. At the table to the left, the petitioner's table where the consortium's case would be presented, she saw Cedric Ashburn, saw him see her. His face went through 3 things in rapid succession, none of them complete before the next one replaced it. She looked away from him. The advocate went forward to speak to the panel's clerk. Ronan set the satchel on the table to the right and opened it. Serafina sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table surface, the way she had pressed them flat on the desk in the library the night she understood what had been done to her, and felt the solid reality of wood under her palms, and breathed once, slowly. The panel's chief, an older woman with the compact authority of someone who had run hearings for 30 years, looked up from her papers and looked directly at Serafina across the chamber. "We have an emergency filing from the office of Advocate Marin Castle," she said, "requesting priority presentation of evidence in the matter of Valewood estate title dispute." She looked at the filing, then back. "This panel will hear the filing before proceeding to the scheduled petition." A sound from the left table. Ashburn, shifting. Behind him, Aldrich, who had taken his seat, going very still. The chief panelist looked at both tables. "Counsel for the emergency filing will present," she said. "You have the floor." The advocate stood. And from the back of the chamber, Serafina heard it before she looked, the particular sound of a door opening at a moment that mattered. Edmund Hargrove walked in. He was alone. He carried nothing except a leather case she recognized from the cartographer's office. He walked to the right table and sat without looking at Aldrich Valewood, and without looking at her, his eyes on the front of the chamber, his jaw set with the particular set of a man who has finished one calculation and begun the only one that remains. The advocate began to speak. The chief panelist leaned forward, and at the left table, Aldrich Valewood's hand moved to the surface in front of him and pressed flat against it. The mirror image, she realized, of her own hands on this table, both of them bracing against the same surface of what was coming. And for the first time since she had walked into his study and refused a marriage and started this entire chain of consequences, she saw in her uncle's face the thing she had never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, fear. The advocate's voice filled the chamber. The evidence began. The advocate spoke for 40 minutes. Serafina had heard the evidence assembled over the course of weeks, had read most of it herself, had traced the financial chains, had sat with the ledgers until the numbers became a language she could read as fluently as any other. But hearing it spoken aloud in the formal chamber, sentence by sentence, was a different experience. It had weight in the air that it had not had on paper. The amounts, the dates, the names, each one landed in the room with the specific gravity of a truth that had been kept below the surface for years and was now breaking it. She watched the panel. The chief panelist wrote continuously, her pen moving without pause, the particular absorption of someone building a record in real time. 2 of the other panelists had stopped their own writing and were simply listening, which was, she had come to understand from watching her family's legal proceedings over the years, a sign that the testimony had moved past the stage of being processed and into the stage of being felt. She watched Aldrich. He was very still. The calculation in his face had resolved into something that was no longer calculation. She could see the moment it happened, perhaps 20 minutes into the advocate's presentation, when Hargrove's name was spoken alongside the merchant's bank lockbox and the 15 years of records it contained. Aldrich's face did not fall. Men like Aldrich did not have faces that fell in public, but something left it. The particular animation of a man managing a situation, and what remained was older and more fixed, the underlying structure without its performance. Kedrick Ashburn, at the left table, had stopped pretending to review his own documents approximately 10 minutes in. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the surface of the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had been handed a situation he had not fully understood when he agreed to be part of it, and was now understanding it completely, too late. She did not feel satisfaction at either of these things. She had expected to. Instead, she felt something quieter and more complicated. The particular exhaustion of a conclusion that was not the same as an ending, because the facts of what had been done to her mother, to her father, to the people sheltered in Ronan's hidden rooms did not resolve cleanly just because the people responsible for them were now sitting in a chamber watching their exposure read aloud. The truth did not undo what had been done. It only ensured it could not continue. That was something. It had to be something. Beside her, Ronan sat with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on the panel and his breathing even. She was aware of him with the particular awareness she had developed over weeks. Not the nervous peripheral attention of someone monitoring a threat, but the settled awareness of someone whose presence had become orienting, the way certain landmarks became orienting in unfamiliar country. You stopped consciously noting them and simply used them to know where you were. When the advocate finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then the chief panelist looked up. "The panel will recess for 1 hour," she said. "All parties will remain available." But they waited in a side corridor, the three of them, Serafina, Ronan, the advocate Marin Cassel, while the witnesses were kept separately in a room off the main hall, and Hargrove sat alone in the corridor's far end with his leather case on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance. Nobody spoke for the first several minutes. There was nothing useful to say, and all three of them understood that. Then Marin said quietly, to no one in particular, "The chief panelist stopped writing at the land transfer section. That means she already had enough and was listening to determine severity. Not guilt, severity." Serafina looked at her. "That's good," Marin said, simply. Then she went back to reviewing her own notes. Ronan looked at Serafina. "When this is done," he said, "there will be a period of formal process. Weeks, maybe longer. The panel's findings go to the Crown's legal office. The consortium members have the right to respond. It will not be immediate." "I know." "And the inheritance challenge will need to be separately adjudicated. Even with the consortium's case undermined, the formal transfer of the title back to your name. Ronan." She looked at him. "I know. We will do it in the right order." She held his gaze. "I am not in a hurry. I have been in a hurry for 7 weeks. I can afford to stop being in a hurry now." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I suppose we can." The hour passed. Nantes. The panel's return was announced by the sound of the chamber doors opening. They filed back in, took their places. The chief panelist set her notes squarely in front of her with the deliberate alignment of someone who had made a decision and was now implementing it. "This panel finds," she said, "that the evidence presented in the emergency filing of Advocate Castle is sufficient to warrant the suspension of all proceedings in the matter of Valewood estate title, pending full investigation by the Crown's Office of Financial Oversight." She looked at the left table. "The petition of Lord Kedrick Ashburn is hereby suspended. The petitioner is directed to make himself available for examination by Crown investigators within the next 7 days." Ashburn's lawyer began to speak. The chief panelist looked at him with an expression that completed his sentence for him and changed its meaning entirely. He stopped. "Furthermore," she said, "given the testimony and records establishing a pattern of conspiracy involving the acquisition of titles and the suppression of witnesses across 6 counties, this panel is directing the immediate referral of this matter to the Crown's High Council for formal inquiry." She looked at the room. Aldrich Valewood, Edmund Hargrove, and the additional parties named in the financial records are directed to surrender their travel documents to the court's officer before leaving this building. Aldrich stood. This panel does not have the authority, he began. Sit down, the chief panelist said, not loudly, with the particular flatness of someone who had not needed volume to establish authority in 30 years and was not going to start now. He sat. She had never seen him sit when told to before. She had seen him manage every room he entered, read it, position himself within it, ensure that the gravity of it bent toward him. She had watched him do it her entire life, at family dinners, at legal proceedings, at the bedside of her dying father. He sat because there was nothing else to do, and she watched it happen and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was held. Not triumph. Something that was the absence of a long-sustained tension, which was not the same thing as triumph, but was real in its own way, real and physical, like the moment when you stopped holding a breath you had forgotten you were holding. The building emptied slowly the way formal buildings did after formal proceedings. The bureaucratic decompression of people who had been in a charged space and were now returning to the ordinary. Clerks gathered papers. Lawyers spoke in lowered voices. The witnesses were brought out of their side room by Marin's assistant and stood blinking in the corridor with the particular look of people who had been told something was over and had not yet processed what over meant for them specifically. Serafina went to them. She did not know them well. She had spoken with each of them once, briefly, in the days before they left the estate, had learned their names, enough of their situations to understand what they had survived. She did not pretend to know more than that, but she stood in front of them and held their gaze and said what was true. The panel has suspended the consortium's case and referred everything for Crown investigation. You are not in immediate danger. Marin will explain the formal protection process, and Ronan's estate, she glanced back at him briefly, will remain available as long as it is needed. The woman who had nodded at her that morning nodded again, slightly larger this time. The older man, she had learned his name was Garrett, that he had been a minor official in the Eastern County Administration who had witnessed a title transfer he was not supposed to witness and had spent 14 months in hiding, looked at her with eyes that were doing several things simultaneously and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is it actually done?" "The danger is substantially reduced," she said. "The investigation will take time, but the people who are hunting you have larger problems than you right now." She held his gaze. "That is the honest answer." He nodded, looked at the floor, looked back up. "Thank you," he said, with the particular weight of someone who does not use those words carelessly and means them to carry everything that cannot be said more specifically. She said, "You're welcome," and meant it in the same register. Outside the building, in the pale afternoon light, she stood on the steps and let the city exist around her for a moment. Ronan came out behind her and stood beside her on the steps, and they looked at the street together. The ordinary traffic of a city afternoon, carts and horses, and people moving through their own purposes, entirely unaware that something had just concluded in the building behind them. "Marcus," she said. "I know. You'll have to decide what to do about him." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "He came. In the end." "He did. It doesn't undo the rest of it." "No," she said. "It doesn't, but it's part of the accounting." He looked at her sideways. "You're more generous about that than I expected." "I'm not generous about it," she said. "I just understand it." He sat across from a man who offered him something he had wanted for a long time, and he made a partial choice in a bad direction, and then he made a better one. She looked at the street. "That's not absolution, but it's not nothing either. What you do with it is your decision." Ronan was quiet for a long time. "My father," he said. "He told me once that the hardest thing about being the person responsible for others was not the weight of their safety. It was what happened to you when you failed them. The weight of the failure." He paused. "I have been carrying that weight for 3 years. 2 people I was protecting did not make it out. Before you arrived. Before any of this." He looked at the street, not at her. "I have not been able to put that down." She turned to look at him fully. His profile in the afternoon light was the profile she had been learning for 7 weeks. The jaw, the scar, the specific economy of a face that had learned not to spend itself on expression it could not afford. But there was something different in it now. Not softer, just less armored. The way a room looked different when the windows were opened, not transformed but aired out, the accumulated weight of sealed air released. "You kept more people safe than you lost," she said. "That is not how it feels." "No," she said. "It never is. That's the price of being the one who decides to be responsible." She held his gaze when he turned to look at her. "You chose to build something in the worst possible conditions, with no allies and no recognition, and a legend designed to keep everyone away from you. And it worked. Not perfectly, but it worked enough that the people in that corridor are alive." She paused. "At some point you have to let the cost be what it was, and let the other part also be true." He looked at her. The things she had noticed in him from the beginning, the controlled distance, the architecture of isolation he had built and lived inside, was still there, in the structure of him. Some things did not dismantle in a morning, but there was a door in it that had not been there before, and she thought they both knew where it was, and neither of them needed to make a speech about it. "The estate," he said. "When we return, there's a great deal of work to do. The consortium's network will not collapse overnight. The investigation will take months, and the edges of it will remain active longer than that. The safe houses, the people still in hiding." "I know," she said. "You do not have to be part of that," he said. "Your inheritance will be restored. You have options that did not exist 7 weeks ago." She looked at him steadily. "Ronan," she said, "yes. Stop telling me what I don't have to do." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "All right. I'm going to go back to the estate," she said, "and I'm going to help finish what we started. And I'm going to do that because it is what needs doing and because I'm useful to it. And those are the only reasons that matter." She paused. "Whatever else is true between us can be addressed in the time we have to address it, which is apparently considerable." Something moved through his face, not the ghost of warmth she had catalogued in the library weeks ago. The thing itself, briefly, before he contained it. Not to hide it from her, she understood now, but because he contained everything, had always contained everything, and learning not to was not an overnight project. "Considerable," he said, as if testing the word. "We have time," she said. "That is new information for both of us." They left the capital the following morning. The evening before, she had written a single letter. Not to Aldrich. There was nothing to say to Aldrich that the hearing had not already said more clearly than she could. She wrote to the only member of her family she had not yet accounted for, a younger cousin, 17, who had been a child when Serafina was still living in the Valewood estate, and who had written her once, after the banishment, a small, careful note asking if she was all right, which was the bravest and most honest thing anyone in that family had done in years. She wrote to say that she was all right, that the situation was being addressed, that the cousin should not worry and should not feel obligated to the family's version of events when that version became public, as it shortly would. She sealed the letter and sent it with the court's messenger service and did not write another. The road north was the same road they had come south on 2 days before, the same farmland, the same pale sky, the same gradual thinning of the city into countryside. But the direction was different, and so the light was different, and so everything familiar looked new in the specific way that the same landscape in reverse always did. Not transformed, but re-revealed, showing you the sides of itself that the first passage had not let you see. She rode beside Ronan. Behind them, in the covered cart, the 3 witnesses slept in shifts, the exhaustion of sustained fear finally releasing now that the immediate danger had passed. Marin had arranged their formal protection documentation and would follow in 3 days. Breck drove without speaking, which was his natural mode, and which she had stopped interpreting as anything other than contentment. They did not talk much on the road north. Some silences were the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. This was the silence of 2 people with so much to say that the order of it mattered, and they were both allowing the order to arrange itself without forcing it. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek that ran alongside the road through a stand of birch trees. She stood at the water's edge and watched the current and thought about the fact that 7 weeks ago she had been in a carriage watching her family's crest disappear into fog, and she had not known what she was going to and had been constructing, in the absence of any information, a version of the future that was simply the fog continuing. The fog had not continued. What she had found in the fog was not what anyone would have predicted. Not safety, not comfort, not the fairy tale arrival at a place that resolved all prior hardship. What she had found was a specific kind of encounter, with a man who had made a decision about what he was going to do with his life, and had paid the full cost of that decision without apology and without anyone to witness the payment. And something in that encounter had asked something of her that she had not known she had not yet been asked. Not to be safe, not to be managed, not to be small enough to fit the space she was allocated, to be as large as what the situation required, to cost something and spend something and be exactly what she was, at full volume, in the direction of something that mattered. She had not known she needed to be asked that. She thought about her mother, the name on the paper, circled, Edwina Valewood, who had found something she was not supposed to find and had paid the final price for it, and who had done it. Serafina understood this now, in the way you understood things about your parents that you could not have understood as a child, not in ignorance but with the knowledge of what it might cost, and who had gone forward anyway because the alternative was the kind of living that was not really living. She had her mother's hands. She had been told that since childhood, and had never understood what it meant as more than a physical fact. She understood it differently now. She heard Ronan come to stand beside her at the water's edge. She did not turn immediately. They both looked at the creek. "The estate," she said. "When we get back. You talked about work to be done." "Yes. And after that, when the investigation is complete, when the people in hiding are able to come out." She paused. "What does it look like then?" He was quiet for a moment. "I genuinely don't know," he said. And the honesty of it was striking, not because honesty was unusual from him, but because this was a different kind. Not the honesty of a man reporting facts, the honesty of a man standing at the edge of a territory he had not mapped because he had not expected to survive long enough to need a map of it. She turned and looked at him. "That is the first time," she said, "that you have told me you don't know something without immediately following it with what you intend to find out." He looked at her. "I suppose it is," he said. "That's progress," she said. He looked at the water for a moment, then back at her. "The estate has been a machine for a long time," he said. "Everything in it oriented toward the work, the people in it, the resources, the structure of every day." He paused. "I am not sure I know how to make it something else. Something that is also—" He stopped. "A home," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. She looked at him, at the scar and the controlled face and the dark eyes that had been reading her accurately since the morning she had walked into his library with his annotated law book in her hands. And she thought about the word home and what it actually meant when you stripped the performance of it away. Not a building, not a family name, not a legacy maintained by people who confused power with love and used one to simulate the other. Something chosen, something built, something that cost you honestly and was worth the cost. "I think," she said, "that you know more about how to make a home than you think you do. You have been doing it for 3 years. You just have not been living in it." He looked at her with the look she had come to know. The precise, unhurried reading of a person, the one that saw past the surface of what was said to the structure underneath. And then something in it shifted. Not closing, but opening. The door she had noticed before, and he let her see what was behind it without armor. It was not complicated. It was just him, tired and real and present, with the scar and the years and the weight he had been carrying and the fact of having carried it and still being here. She held his gaze and let him see her the same way. They stood at the water's edge for a long moment. Then Breck called from the cart that the horses were ready, with the particular timing of a man who had seen things and understood when to interrupt them, and chose to do so now because the road was long and the afternoon was moving. She stepped back from the water. Ronan stepped back beside her. They walked back to the horses. The estate came into view in the early evening, catching the last light. She looked at it the way she had looked at it the first time. That arrival through the fog, the dark stone, the iron gate standing open. But the way she looked at it was different. The first time she had been reading it as an unknown, constructing the story of it from the outside, from rumor and fear and the particular defensiveness of a person expecting threat. Now she read it as a place she knew, the library's south wing, the kitchen where Mrs. Harwick made tea with the focused practicality of a woman who understood that occupation was its own kind of care, the east corridor where the dog slept, unconcerned with arrivals, the estate office where she had sat with Ronan's ledgers spread across the desk and understood, for the first time, what kind of man he actually was. Not a monster, not a legend, not the cursed Duke of the stories, which had always been a costume worn over something harder and more real. A man who had decided at some point in the dark what he was going to do with the fact of being alive, and had done it without asking whether it was going to cost him something. The gates were open. They rode through. Mrs. Harwick was on the steps. She looked at Seraphina's face, and then at Ronan's face, and then at the cart behind them, and something in the severity of her own face shifted. Not warmth exactly, because Mrs. Harwick's face did not traffic in warmth as an expression, but its structural equivalent, the recognition of a good outcome by someone who had not been certain one was coming. "I'll have dinner ready in an hour," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Harwick," Ronan said. She went inside. Seraphina dismounted and stood in the courtyard and looked up at the house in the evening light. Behind her, Ronan dismounted and came to stand beside her, and they both looked at it for a moment. The dark stone, the lit windows, the particular quality of a place that was inhabited rather than occupied, that held the texture of lives lived in it rather than staged in it. "It needs work," he said. Not apologetically, just factually. "Yes," she said. "It does." The East Wing especially. The hidden rooms will need to be converted to something functional now that they no longer need to be hidden. "Guest rooms," she said, "for people who actually want to be here." He looked at her sideways. "That is a significant change," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "The curse," he said. "The legend. It will take time to dismantle. People believe what they've believed for years." "Let them adjust at their own pace," she said. "The truth is out. They'll find it." She looked at him. And a duke with a documented record of sheltering people at personal cost and bringing a kingdom-spanning conspiracy to account is not an easy man to keep calling cursed. "The story will change." "Stories do," he said. "They do," she agreed. The last of the evening light was going. The first stars were appearing, faint in the darkening sky, in the specific slow way that stars appeared when you were far enough from the city that you could actually see them. She had forgotten that. The Valewood estate had been far enough from the city, technically, but she had spent so many years inside its rooms that she had stopped looking up. She looked up now. Beside her, she was aware of Ronan's hand finding hers, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just the quiet arrival of one hand alongside another, the way you reached for something you had decided you were going to reach for, and then reached for it. She turned her hand and held his. They stood in the courtyard of Blackthorn Estate as the dark came fully down, holding the quiet of a moment that did not need to be made larger than it was. And she thought about all the words that had been used to describe this house and this man, cursed, feared, dangerous, isolated. And she thought about what those words had covered and what they had failed to say. And she thought about her mother's name on a piece of paper in a hidden room, and her father's face at the end, and the child who had written "safe" in charcoal on the back of packing paper. She thought, we are responsible for the stories we let stand unchallenged. She thought, I am done letting those stand. She thought, this is what it looks like to stop managing your life from a distance and step into the actual middle of it. And it is nothing like what you imagine when you are standing outside of it. And it is better, and it costs more, and the cost is exactly what it should cost. Mrs. Harwick appeared in the doorway. "Dinner," she said. They went inside. The door closed behind them on the dark, and the estate held its light against it the way it had always held its light. And the gates at the entrance stood open as they always had. Not in carelessness, she understood now, but in the deliberate choice of a man who had decided that the thing he was building should be available to anyone who needed it, who had made his house into a promise kept at great cost to himself, and who had been alone in that for a long time and was not alone in it anymore. Months later, when they married in the courtyard where she had first arrived, the gates were open then too. The people they had sheltered came. The village came. Marin Castle came, with the completed documentation of the Crown's investigation and the formal restoration of Serafina's inheritance in a leather folder she set on the table with the satisfaction of a woman who had waited a long time to close a file. Marcus came with the particular quality of a man still in the middle of a reckoning with himself, and was seated near the front because Ronan had decided, in the end, that the accounting between brothers was not finished and should not be treated as finished. The Valewood name appeared in the proceedings 3 months after the hearing, attached to formal charges that moved through the Crown's legal process, with the unhurried certainty of a mechanism that had finally been set in motion and would not stop. Aldrich was stripped of his council seat in the spring. The consortium dissolved the way such things dissolved when their financial architecture was exposed to daylight, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet and systematic withdrawal of each piece, the structure unmade in the same order it had been made. Kedrick Ashburn wrote her a letter. She read it once. It said what she expected it to say. Regret framed as clarification, culpability framed as circumstance. She set it aside and did not respond, not out of cruelty but out of the understanding that some conversations had already happened in the only form that counted, and a letter after the fact was not the conversation but its eulogy. The legend of the cursed Duke died slowly, the way legends did when the truth was more interesting than the story. People who had avoided the estate began to approach it tentatively, then regularly, then as a matter of course. The village that had respected Ronan in silence began to do so in the open, which was a different thing and mattered differently. The dark stone of the house remained dark stone because it was stone and that was its nature, but nobody looked at it the way they had looked at it before, and the difference was visible in the way people walked toward it rather than away. Serafina stood at the window of the library on an afternoon in late autumn, watching the grounds, and thought about what it meant to build something real on the site of something false. Not easy, not clean. The foundation of the old story was still there underneath the new one, would always be there, Shem. The years of isolation, the lives that had been lost, the cost that had been paid in the dark without acknowledgement. You did not build over that as if it had not existed. You built with it as part of the ground, visible if you looked, the true measure of what it had taken to be here. Ronan came in without knocking, which was something he had started doing, and which she had not commented on because it meant something she did not need to make into a statement. He set a cup of tea on the desk beside her. She looked at it, then at him. "The petition from the Eastern tenants," he said, "about the road repair. I read it this morning. And? The estimate is too high by about a third. The supplier they've quoted has a relationship with the old county administrator, one of the consortium's peripheral people. We should get a second quote from the firm in the North Quarter." She picked up the tea. "I've drafted a response." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face. That thing she had learned to read, the thing that was not quite a smile but was its structural cousin, the indication that he was pleased in a way that sat deeper than surface expression. "You were reading the contractor relationships in the petition," he said. "I read everything," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." She looked at him across the library, the room that had been his for years, the room where she had first understood what kind of man he was by the things he chose to annotate, the room that was now as much hers as his, without any formal declaration having been required. "Ronan," she said. "Yes." "The gates." He looked at her steadily. "What about them?" "When they brought me through them the first time, I thought they were left open because no one had thought to close them." She held his gaze. "I understand now that they were left open because you decided they should be, as a practice, as a principle." "Yes," he said. She nodded, looked back at the grounds. "Keep them that way," she said. He came to stand beside her at the window, and they looked out at the autumn grounds together, at the bare trees and the cold sky and the road that ran from the gates down to the village and beyond it to the larger world, open in both directions, available to anyone coming or going, the same in either case. "Yes," he said. They stood there together as the afternoon light moved across the floor of the library, slow and certain, the way light moved through rooms that were lived in, and outside the gates of Blackthorn Estate stood open as they always had, as they would continue to stand. Not in carelessness, but in the deliberate, costly, renewable choice of two people who had come to understand that the only legacy worth building was one that made room for others, and had decided, with full knowledge of what it required, to build it.